Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole eventually gets us to bullying and bears.
The bears.
But, as always, we have to get there. This week's Torah portion, Parshas Behar, includes several laws about ethical business practices. And at one point it says, when you sell anything to your fellow or buy anything from your fellow, al toinu ish es achiv, don't harm your brother. Which means don't hurt each other financially through business dealing. This is called oinas mamain, or inflicting monetary pain. But then a little later on, that word gets repeated again. V'loisoinu ish es amisoi. A man shall not hurt his fellow, and you shall fear your God, for I am Hashem your God. And when it gets repeated that second time, it means something different. The Gemara tells us, and all the commentaries agree, that the second instance of this idea of not hurting each other is talking about oinas devarim, hurting people with words. Sefer HaChinuch lists this as one of the mitzvahs in the Parsha, and gives us a few examples from Gemara, but it's more concise here in Sefer HaChinuch, so that's where I'm going to quote it from. The first example is about someone who's a Baal Tshuva, somebody who's done bad things in the past and has now repented and shaped up, and you shouldn't give them a hard time about their past. The second example is not to tell somebody who's going through painful situations in life that it's because of something they did, that somehow it's a consequence of their actions. The third example is if donkey drivers are looking for a place to buy donkey food, you shouldn't deliberately tell them to go to a place where you know they don't have donkey food. And the last example is not to ask a merchant how much an item costs if you have no intention of buying it. So this is a pretty wide scope. We've got pranks, verbal abuse, dishonesty, just wasting people's time, really any way you can hurt somebody through words. But the thing that's most interesting to me is that this is where Torah prohibits bullying. And specifically within that category of bullying, there's a specific brand of bullying that gets addressed, which is name-calling, and how terrible that is. The Talmud actually says that people who call other people mean names are punished differently in the afterlife than most other people, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So that's where this week's rabbit hole starts, with bullying and specifically name-calling in Torah. If you're ready to see where that leads us, let's dive in. First, let's start out with a story in Sefer Malachim, the book of Kings, about the prophet Elisha. Elisha was the protege of Eliyahu HaNavi, Elijah the prophet, and this story takes place right after Eliyahu was beamed up to the heavens alive, leaving Elisha to now take on his role among the Jewish people. So he was walking along, and a bunch of little boys came out and started teasing him and chanting, "Go away, Baldy, go away, Baldy." Elisha turned around and saw them and cursed them in the name of Hashem, and then 2 bears came out of the forest and killed 42 of the boys.
And one of the campers was eaten by a bear.
Okay, so that's a pretty wild story. And also, I just want to point out, that's a lot of kids to be teased by. I've been teased by a group of a few kids, but to be teased and taunted by over 42 kids, that's rough. So I actually wasn't familiar with this story at all, but I was told that it's a particularly famous story, and that a lot of people use it as part of a criticism of religion in general. Why would you believe in a God that would punish a bunch of kids like this? So apparently this story really raises a lot of difficult and challenging theological questions for a lot of people. Anyways, let's talk about the bears. The Gemara tells us that there's a disagreement between Rav and Shmuel. One of them says that there was one miracle here. The bears didn't exist, and then they were created miraculously to punish the bullies. The other opinion says that there were 2 miracles. It was a miracle within a miracle. There were no bears, and there was no forest. So the forest was created through a miracle, and then the bears were created through another miracle inside that forest, and then they came out and attacked the bullies. So then the Gemara asks, according to that second opinion, that it was a miracle within a miracle, there were no bears, no forest, both of them were created. What's the point of the miraculous appearance of a forest? What purpose does that serve? Just make the bears appear. Why do we need for them to come out of a forest? And the Gemara answers, because of fear. So Rashi explains what that means. What does it mean, fear? Who's fear? Who's afraid? He says that it means that the bears would be afraid. If there was no forest for them to hide in, they would be afraid to venture out into the middle of a populated area. But if they had a forest, then they would feel safe enough to attack a bunch of mean little boys.
I love it out here in the woods. It's where a bear should be.
Okay, so the thing that I liked about that is this idea that if God's using animals for a miracle, then the comfort of those animals would be taken into account. You don't want the miracle bears to be scared, and I think that's sweet. But when I started digging around for more commentaries on this, I saw that the Parshah disagrees with Rashi's interpretation here. He says this doesn't make any sense. Miracle bears wouldn't be afraid of attacking a bunch of little kids, even without a forest nearby. They're miracle bears. So he offers a different way of interpreting the Gemara's answer here. He says that we're not talking about the bears being afraid, we're talking about the kids being afraid. If there was no forest and the bears just appeared out of nowhere, out of thin air, and started running towards them, the boys would see them coming and run away, and then the whole thing would just fall apart. But if the bears pop out from behind a tree, the boys won't see them coming. So, as I've mentioned before in this series, I like it when there are two completely different ways to interpret a story, and both of them make complete sense. But I also really like seeing technical breakdowns of the mechanics of a miracle, and this bear thing had both, so that was fun. One more thing I want to point out before we move on from this story. Anti-bullying. It's a big thing, and schools spend a lot of resources trying to address that problem, and perhaps the answer has been right in front of us the entire time. If schools had a couple of bears on the premises, and bullies were sent to the bear room, I think that might solve the problem. The only problem is, the bullies would probably end up figuring out how to get the kid that they're bullying sent to the bear room, so never mind, scratch that, no bear room. Okay, so now let's look at that Gemara that I mentioned earlier about bullies and the afterlife. It says everyone who descends to Gehenna eventually gets out, except for 3 types of people: an adulterer, someone who humiliates someone else, and someone who calls a person a mean nickname. So before we continue with this, I just want to point out 2 things. First, it's pretty amazing that name-calling and adultery are considered to be in the same league in this context. Adultery is a pretty big deal. It's one of the Aseret Adibros, the 10 Commandments, one of the first things God ever told us about when we received the Torah on Mount Sinai. So it's pretty wild to me that bullies are lumped together with adulterers, specifically in the context of being punished in the afterlife worse than everybody else in the entire world. Which leads me to the second thing. There's actually a general principle that nobody is punished in Gehenna for more than 12 months. So for the Gemara to say that bullies and adulterers never leave is kind of a big deal. I actually had a whole tangent of this rabbit hole exploring different ways of dealing with that problem, but it got too long and technical, so I decided to leave it out. If you want me to get into that Gehenna stuff in a future rabbit hole, let me know in the comments. Okay, so after that list of the 3 types of people who get punished forever, the Gemara asks, hey, what's the difference between the last 2? Someone who humiliates another person and somebody who calls a person a mean name. Why do we need both of them? When you call somebody a mean name, you're humiliating them. So it's the same thing. And the Gemara answers because this is talking about a situation where the person being called the name is used to it already.
Oh, hey, I'm used to it.
Rashi explains that this means that it doesn't bother them anymore. It doesn't embarrass the person, and it doesn't make them feel bad. But even if it doesn't bother the person being called the name, if the person doing the name calling is saying it to be mean, then it's still bad. So bad that they'll never get out of Gehenna. So this is actually something that jumped out at me many years ago when I first learned these halachas, the laws of being mean to people. And since then, I've been fascinated by this idea of the significance of being mean even when the person you're being mean to doesn't even know that you're being mean, and they don't feel hurt. And I've thought a lot about which is worse. Before we move on to the next thing, I want to talk about Furbies. Furbies are an animatronic toy that was released in 1998, and it was huge.
What's that? It's my Furby.
They could blink and talk and maybe even dance, I think. But a few years later, the designer of the Furby, Caleb Chung, wanted to create something even more real. So he started his own company and created an animatronic dinosaur toy named Pleo, which was a lot more sophisticated and showed a lot more emotion. And one of the things that they programmed into it was pain responses. If you were mean to Pleo, it would cry and moan and behave like it was actually being hurt. And the idea was to help people learn to be nice to it.
You know, our belief is that humans need to feel empathy towards things in order to be more human, and we think we can help that out by having little creatures that you can love.
But what ended up happening was that people liked hurting this toy dinosaur. The fact that they knew it was being hurt and that it reacted to it made people want to hurt it even more. And as a result, the guy who created it felt very conflicted about what to do about that for future toys.
For my little company, I've adopted kind of a Hippocratic oath, like, don't teach something that's wrong, or don't reinforce something that's wrong. And so I've been working on this problem for years. I'm struggling with what's the right thing to do.
So I thought that was fascinating, and it adds another layer to this idea of the significance of the reaction of the person being bullied. But it also raises another question. Is it wrong to bully robots? If it's still wrong to bully someone who isn't hurt by the bullying, like the Gemara says, then maybe it's wrong to bully something that is completely incapable of feeling hurt. Let me know your thoughts on that in the comments. Okay, so now we know that it's bad to call somebody a mean name even if they don't think it's mean. But what if nobody thinks it's mean? Rambam, or Maimonides, mentions name-calling in a list of relatively lighter transgressions that still result in a person not having a share in the world to come. There are a bunch of things on this list, mostly having to do with hurting or disrespecting people. And the first two are Hamachana Shem Lechavere and Hakoder Lechavere Bechinuyoi. Somebody who coins a nickname for somebody else, and somebody who calls a person by a nickname. So, two interesting things are happening here. First of all, if you noticed, he took out the word ra, bad, a bad name or a mean name. Now it's just any name that isn't their actual name. So that broadens this idea even more. The other thing is that he splits it up into two different things. The person who invents the name and the people who continue to use it. And the reason this is interesting to me is because I've always been fascinated by the role of creativity in bullying. Most bullies are lazy and unoriginal, but some bullies are genuinely clever and innovative.
Clever girl.
Which is really weird to me. So it's interesting to see both types of bullies being called out here. Okay, so now not only is it bad to call someone names if they don't think it's mean, it's even bad if you don't think it's mean. But there's another level. The Gemara says that the students of Rav Ada bar Ahava asked him why he merited to live to be very old. And he lists off a bunch of good things that he was always careful about. And the last one is, he says, that I was always careful not to call somebody by their nickname. Just a note, he just says nickname here, and not a bad name. And some commentaries say that that's likely what Rambam was basing his ruling on. Anyways, then the Gemara informs us of an alternate version of that last item on the list. That instead of never calling anyone by a nickname, he says he never called anybody by their family name. So now we've got a whole new level. You can't even call somebody by their last name. Tosfos adds the meanness back into this story, which I guess would be in disagreement with Rambam. They say that the nickname version is talking about a mean nickname, even though it doesn't say that explicitly. And for the family name version, they say that this is also specifically talking about when it's used to disgrace someone. But if it's used to praise them, then it's okay to call them by their last name. So there are two ways I can read this, and I'm not sure which one is right. One way is that it's talking about different types of surnames, that there are some surnames that are disgraceful, just the actual name. I guess maybe something like Horst Thiefowitz. The other way to read it would be that it's saying that you could actually use any surname in a mean way or a nice way. And if you're wondering how you can use somebody's last name to be mean, just think about high school gym teachers.
Hey, Glubman, get off the field! I coached you from the team a week ago!
But the Ben Ish Chai takes a different approach to this. He seems to be going according to the interpretation that we're not talking about names that are particularly mean, and that Rav Ada bar Ahava lived a particularly long life partly in thanks to never calling anybody by anything but their actual first name. And he says that there's a reason for this, because it's known that the life force of a person is dependent on the letters of their name. So when you refer to somebody by their actual name, this reinforces that life force which is connected to that name.
Say my name.
So you're actually giving someone more vitality, and as a result, it bounces back, and that's why Rav Ada bar Ahava lived such a long life. So here's what I like about that. Calling someone mean names or even not so mean names, I get that that's bad. I see the pain that causes. It's a big deal. But calling someone by their name is just normal, and it's kind of a bummer that the right thing is often a lot more boring than the wrong thing. It's kind of like how the bad guys in stories are almost always a lot more interesting than the heroes. But this explanation from the Ben Ish Chai tells us that every time we just call somebody by their regular name, we're accessing the conduit through which their life force is drawn down into them and boosting it, which I think is super cool. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. As always, if you have any questions or want to show me something cool I missed, put it in the comments. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. And by the way, the rabbit has a name. It's Arnie, and that's what you should be calling him.